Welcome to the third part of this workshop on AI. Today we're going to be doing a tour of Debateland. I'm going to give you an overview of some of the common arguments and how to mitigate, rebut them, or make them, and also some of my own thoughts on this. First argument is energy and water, because we often hear about these AI systems using a lot of energy and water, and that this has a negative impact on the climate. First, let me give you some cons to this and mitigation slash rebuttal. I think it's first important to denote the distinction between querying and training. Basically, this AI indeed uses a lot of energy and water in its training, because this is a very computationally intense process. This is not so much the case when the system's already trained and you're just asking it a question. This is relatively unintensive when it comes to resource strain. Therefore, you could make the argument here that we maybe, if we really care about the climate, we shouldn't continue training AI, but AI in its current state we can definitely use with minimal climate impact and a lot of the efficiency gains it brings. Second is, you can mitigate this, I think, by saying it helps with a lot of efficiency and productivity gains. Because yes, training AI costs a lot of energy and water, so does spending 5 hours figuring out how to convert a file. If you had asked AI this, or there was an easier answer that wouldn't take so long to find, then probably this might even be more efficient, even when you account for the fact that AI has taken a lot of resources to be trained. So therefore, it might just be beneficial. Or at least there's some trade-off here between how efficient slash productive AI is. Because sometimes, for example, when I try to find documentation, when I'm coding a program, it's just much faster than looking this up myself. If it saves me 2 minutes of looking something up every time I have to look something up, now this just makes me more productive. 1 second, this just means my laptop might not be on as long. I don't make as much use of Google, all of which also takes energy, right? Third one is slightly more interesting, and it's important to know the background, a bit of background information first. When you're training AI, this is a computer. It just uses electricity. And it's important to know that, for example, in the Netherlands, we have a lot of solar panels, and this has led to a net congestion problem where we're actually creating too much energy during the middle of the day because of the amount of solar panels that we have. And we cannot amp up our consumption at that specific time of day. So this energy has nowhere to go, and that is a big problem. If we could use these big data centers to actually offload some of the strain on this grid by simply consuming this energy, this would actually save a lot on maintenance, and this would make sure we don't need to we don't need to replace or improve our energy grid to the same extent. Therefore, can help the net congestion problem. Then, as for the water, water is just used as a coolant for these AI systems, right? It's not consuming water in the way that humans might consume this water. It's not contaminating the water, or at least not necessarily so if we're just using it to cool these systems. At that point, can we not simply send this now slightly warmer water back to the source and still use this? Actually, in winter, perhaps even, or even in summer, if we're warming this water up, can we not send this to houses instead of houses warming using gas to warm the water themselves so they can take hot showers? These are some of these sort of circular energy economies being thought up around AI. And I think that specific idea can be quite useful when you're arguing policy motions about AI, because there's a lot of good mitigation on the resources that AI uses. Because if this electricity is just converted to heat to some extent, because that is all the, how do I put this? That is all the lost energy, so to say. It's just heat, which is now being absorbed by this water. can we not use this to warm our houses? Can we not make use of this in some other way? Then, as for the reasons that this AI does consume water, and this is actually a negative thing. First of all, companies want to improve their product. And that's also how they get like investment, right? Company improves, gets more customers, gets more profitable, et cetera, et cetera. And this hype sort of keeps training going. Because also at this moment, AI is not a profitable industry. Oh, I don't think AI has made a profit since it started. And at that point, there needs to be an end goal. So either they up their prices, which probably not a good idea yet, or they have to explain this and justify this by saying, no, 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 but we're actually going to find AGI, or we're going to find massively improved versions of our current product. And therefore, we need more investment, and therefore, we're going to keep training. It's also just necessary to improve the AI, even if slightly, to be more competitive than other companies. This is also why some like Google won't suddenly stop training Gemini, because then OpenAI just gets a better product because they do continue training, and then people will only use ChatGPT and not Gemini. Another reason that this is very intensive on and has a big resource strain is apart from like the energy and water used by the data centers themselves. Because if you believe all the mitigation on the con side, we can like completely reuse this energy and water, perhaps. Okay, even if then building this computer or building all of these processors is not free, right? You're shipping precious minerals halfway across the world. You're using precision machinery and you're shipping them back. You're building these data centers, etc. You have to mine these minerals. You have to find lithium. You have to find gold, etc., etc. Uh, Building a computer is a very technologically complex and resource intensive process. So even that in and of itself is an extreme strain on our resources and therefore the climate. And last reason, people of like these companies just want a lot of users. That's generally how tech investment tends to work. You offer your product for way, way too low of a price. You get a bunch of users, so you have to show, hey, there's actually market interest for this product. Then you get more investors and you try to expand your user base. And you keep doing that until at some point you decide, okay, now we're going to start making a profit. This is what Amazon has done, for example. And it's also the reason that the real price of like energy and water is not reflected in the prices of AI because they don't want this. They want to first get people used to using the AI, make it somewhat dependent, make them like the product, etc., for very attractive prices. And then eventually, this investment's going to stop and they're going to start earning money. By that point, a lot of the strain on our resources has been done. Then, labor crisis. This is also an argument you hear often that AI is going to cause a labor crisis, mass unemployment, due to it replacing a large part of our workforce. First way to rebut or mitigate this is to use empiric evidence. Basically, there's a bunch of studies out there, like large language models, small labor effects, which is a Danish study that shows that in 2 or 3 years after ChatGPT first entering the workplace, the effects have actually not been very big, statistically insignificant even, and that this actually hasn't replaced that many people, and companies haven't really found a way to do that. Then the MIT integration study, which showed that 95% of AI integrations don't see any returns, and it's just a loss for the company to have tried this. And I think this is at least some empirical evidence pointing in the direction that either the AI isn't good enough yet, or we can't use it well enough yet, or the combination of the way that we've designed our workforce and the AI is just somewhat incompatible. Second reason that it might be unlikely to cause a labor crisis is accountability. Uh, Basically, people like being able to blame people. That is, if I'm a manager, I want to be able to, if there is sort of a fuck up in my team, if then I can just fire someone or I can reprimand someone and let my manager know, hey, something's been done, this will be better in the future, etc. If there's just an AI working under me that I'm supervising, well, the problem probably isn't going to be with the AI, or at least I'm going to have a hard time explaining that to my manager. So then the problem is me. That means a lot of middle management and even upper management want people under them, uh, even just for the simple reason that they have someone to blame instead of themselves when something goes down. Then there's also just company infrastructure, right? A lot of the current systems have been set in place to work with humans. Humans are also just quite adaptable. That is to say, if something happens, humans are relatively good at finding decent ways to solve the problem. Even like perhaps breaking some rules or at least breaking like traditional reporting structure for the company or company policy, whatever. But if something needs to get done, we'll figure out a way to do it. And we know how to navigate this infrastructure because it's also been built for us. This is not necessarily the case for AI. And a lot of company infrastructure is just very difficult to navigate because you're also communicating with all kinds of different companies. You have specific supply chains, specific legacy software, which might not have been part of the AI's training data. So it doesn't actually know how to use Fortran, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of legacy in a company, and a lot of work has already been put into making this very efficient. That AI might not be able to compete with or might not be able to work with. Another reason is that AI sucks. Like sometimes its output is just bad. It's quite good at a bunch of things, especially if you know how to use it. But if you give it too much freedom, if you don't give it very clear instructions, it's not going to give you a very useful answer. Uh, and even if you give it clear instructions, sometimes it doesn't know because you're working on something very new that's not part of the AI's training set. So it doesn't quite know how to answer that question because it hasn't seen questions like it before. And the reasoning capabilities of an AI seem to be relatively limited, at least at this point in time, so that it doesn't know how to work with new situations as well as humans often do. And the last one is user error. At least the current forms of AI often still require human input or at least human supervision. If you want this to then be effective, these humans also have to know how to use the AI effectively, which a lot of humans don't, uh, and might also not be able to learn, right? Because it's a skill in and of itself. It's the same reason why a lot of people don't work well with computers or can do some basic stuff, but when they encounter something new, they have trouble adapting to this. The same thing is true for AI. AI in and of itself is already massively more user friendly, but there is still a lot of room for user error. Therefore, even if you want the workforce to adapt, a large part of the workforce might not be able to work with AI. Then, the reasons that this labor crisis might indeed be impending. Uh, it just helps the company's bottom line if they have less salaries to pay. So investors push upper management to do this, even if it doesn't work well, or even if yeah, it leads to suboptimal outcomes in the long run. Then the AI hype train also makes this seem feasible and urgent because you just have a lot of marketing, right? And you hear a lot about how this is going to do massively amazing things, which maybe it does. And at that point, you believe, oh, maybe I should use this in my work. I'm going to try to see what I can do, and it leads to at least a little bit of experimentation. And also, some people just work really well with AI. It is really good at doing some things. It's also very good at giving you the obvious answer in a slightly nicer way than Google did. That's also why you have the AI overview thing with Google now. Because instead of typing your question and Google giving you uh, sources, which you then have to comb through yourselves, AI just gives you an answer. And you can even ask the AI, oh, could you phrase this more intuitively? Or could you help explain this better? Which you can't ask these sources to do. The sources are simply the sources, right? So it can be really good at some things. Then there's the question of whether AI is too big to fail. That is to say, it is unlikely that this entire industry is useless. So probably there's some way to use this AI really effectively, to use it really well. Um, and even if that's not what we imagine it to be now, and sort of the dystopian or the futuristic view, there is probably some way. At the point where billions of investment have gone into this, people want to see a return on their investment, so they will also invest in trying to find some way to make this product viable. So it might, in that sense, be too big to fail. Also, considering the size of these companies, it might be the case that the American government steps in, because otherwise it leads to a massive stock market crash if these companies turn out to be worthless. Who knows? And then you sort of have the free market collective action problem, which is basically the idea of nobody, like, let me put this first. Nobody wants a labor crisis. Nobody wants mass unemployment because this just isn't good for the economy. Even like the AI companies, they're dependent on companies being able to make a profit to pay for their tools. These companies are in turn dependent on having like a good amount of people that have money to spend in the economy. So they don't actually want these mass layoffs. The problem is that if their competitor does do it, then that competitor can sell their goods for cheaper, and then they're outcompeted. So even if nobody in the end actually wants this massive adaptation of AI, because it's going to lead to this dystopian outcome where 50% of people is unemployed or something like that, um, companies want to be the one that is still around at that time and still has a business model. They don't want to be the company that got left behind because they were the only one that didn't do that out of principle, didn't do the AI adaptations. So there's a bit of a collective action problem in there, forcing companies to be more efficient, to be able to sell their goods, especially because at the point where you don't do this, a competitor does. They get 30% more efficient. They can offer their goods for way cheaper. Even if at that point you realize you made a mistake and you want to adapt AI, you're 2 years too late. Maybe you have enough liquidity to make it this way and then still be somewhat competitive, but generally this is a worst case scenario type of thing, right? All right, next one. Data leading to biases. We often hear arguments about AI being trained on biased data and how this leads to the structure, this leads to the reinforcement of structural barriers for some groups, etc. I think there are a couple of ways you can mitigate this or rebut this. I think, first of all, racism is inaccurate, right? These companies want to design a useful and truthful tool. At that point, probably they're going to be excluding some data that is racist, that is sexist, or whatever it is, simply because it's inaccurate and it leads to pollution of their data, leads to a less effective AI because they want the AI to be good and truthful. So, just inaccuracy reasons, they will try to make this AI uh, equitable slash politically correct. And then suboptimal outcomes. And this is partially because of the inaccuracy, right? But apart from the just being truthful, which is a sort of a principled thing, um, it also just leads to suboptimal outcomes. Because if let's say you're using an AI in a hiring process, right? If you don't hire a candidate because they belong to some kind of minority group, even though they have better qualifications than the other candidates, this is just suboptimal, right? You want the better candidate because that leads to your business performing better. um, and you being more effective. So if you want to design a useful tool, again, it doesn't do you any good if the data is biased or the AI is biased. Third reason, you can scrub variables, which you cannot do with humans. Again, to use like the hiring process example, if I read someone's resume as a person, I have my own internal biases. So if I see a certain name, be this like a female name, be this some kind of name belong to a certain ethnicity, I myself immediately associate this perhaps with some other stuff, right? And this perhaps makes me less likely to hire this person if I suffer from these internal biases, which some people do. There is not really a way to erase this subconscious process. However, you, especially when you do stuff like in-person interviews or something like this. However, when you're using an AI, you can just scrub these variables. You can just say, you can just erase the gender data, the race data, ethnicity data, whatever. And the AI just cannot make a decision now based on these factors. And last argument, outrage, especially in the tech industry. People see the tech industry as this futuristic, progressive industry, and they like that sort of a promise for a better tomorrow thing. And at that, and then obviously they don't want these companies to be racist, sexist, whatever. So this is just going to lead to a bunch of outrage. People then don't want to use this tool as much because they feel that using this tool also reflects badly onto them and might even bias them in their thinking because they're interacting with this tool so much. And companies therefore have an incentive for making these tools perhaps equitable, or at the very least, very PC, like politically correct. You also can test this because if you ask it about controversial topics, it will simply answer like, "Oh, I can't talk about that," or "Let me instead give you a recipe for apple cinnamon cake," or something like this, right? Now, the reason that this might still happen, like the pro, uh, there's a leadership inherent bias. That's to say, often tech tends to be a male-dominated industry, also tends to be somewhat white-dominated. This means that you have some inherent biases that come into play. The people who test these systems might not know, might not be cognizant of their own bias as much. Secondly, there's a rat race going on. Like everybody's trying to design the best possible system. So if you spend a lot of time making sure your data is quite perfect before you get to training, you start training way later, you push your model to market later, which is the question whether you want to make that trade-off or not. Third reason, oversight is relatively minimal. That is to say, we don't have a lot of government testing or government supervision on the data sets that are being used to train this AI. So these companies might very well be using that, and there's no real way to check. And that also means that if it doesn't show up yet, or it doesn't, or we can't see that a certain bias shows up in the way that this AI system works, then there is no real check whether it might still be happening like subconsciously in the AI, and it's just a fact that we can't quite see this ourselves. You also have, and this is specifically rebuttal to the scrubbing variables, Amazon's hiring problem. At some point, a couple of years ago, this is like an example I heard of that was taught to me by a professor in like the first lecture of computer science I ever had. Um, Amazon designed a system to help them decide which person to hire in interview, and based on resume and all kinds of personal data. And they designed this based off of their current workforce and who performed well. And this AI was massively sexist. Like it would only hire men. And they were like, okay, well that we know that that's not accurate. We know that this was a suboptimal outcome. So the people designing this tool were like, okay, We got to fix that. Now, what did they do? They scrubbed variables. They removed gender from the data. And somehow the AI still only hired men. And they were puzzled for a while because they had no idea how the AI could possibly be able to still be sexist, even though it had no idea anymore. Now, they did a bunch of testing, and at some point they found out that it wasn't actually selecting for men, it was selecting for people who had been in a chess club. Because all of their best performing employees had at some point been part of a chess club and had also put this on their resume or their personality review, I guess. And it then started selecting for that in new candidates as well. And because chess is a relatively gendered sport, it then ended up only hiring men. That is to say, you can scrub some of these variables, but there might still be ways to tell and still ways that structural biases or barriers show up. Oh, and last reason that this AI might be biased, user influence. The AI wants to be nice and useful to you, wants to validate you, at the point where you yourself are a biased individual. Maybe the AI won't be as biased as you, maybe it won't fully reflect you, but it probably wouldn't push you as much. Therefore, it might still give you somewhat biased data, or it may say something to the effect of like, I really understand where you're coming from, etc. And users might also just make use of some of the exploit to explicitly turn an AI less equitable. And then the last part, which I think a lot of people might have been waiting for, AGI, and basically the futuristic idea of a super intelligent digital being that might govern us or whatever. Um, First, let me say that there is no scientific consensus on this. People then much smarter than me disagree with each other on the likelihood of AGI, and specifically also whether our current technology will get us there. Some people on the Google DeepMind team think this is going to happen. Jan LeCun, Turing Award winner, doesn't think that this is going to happen. All of these people are massively more qualified than me. I can at best offer you my educated guess. First of all, there's a limit to the amount of data. We already hit this some time ago, and a lot of these AI companies now ask people to generate data for them, specifically like high quality data, in the hope that we can further the learning process. Because if you don't have more training data, then at some point your learning is also going to stagnate. Then there is a limit to the amount of computation. Like we can only produce so many processors. I think OpenAI for its next round of funding asked for like some ridiculous number to buy a whole lot more computers. It's going to take a lot of time to process this, uh, to produce this, and there's only so much computational compute available. Probably if it's going to take orders of magnitude more than what we have now, AGI is still very far off. There's also just the limit of energy, right? We already consume a lot of energy, and our electrical grids, our power, or even other ways of finding energy, we're trying to use less energy for global warming. We don't massively want to ramp this up. And there's just a limit to how much energy we have available. So there's also a limit to what extent we can train AI systems. There's also somewhat a limit to the methodology. That is to say, in my first video, I explained how neural networks work. And usually with local search and sort of the way that we train this AI, you can get like marginally better solutions. But at the end of the day, you're just making slightly better guesses as to what the most statistically likely correct answer is. And here comes some like theoretical disagreements. Some people are then of the opinion that Since it's only trying to mimic current human thought, it cannot create anything new. And, and therefore, this is a fundamental limit to the technology. And that would, if that's the case, also explain why there have been very few scientific breakthroughs using AI. Not completely using AI. AI won like the chemistry and physics award a couple of years ago, or at least AI scientists, but that was for a very different system like than the large language models that we're talking about today. And the last reason is believing in AGI with the current methodology also sort of means believing in a theory of everything. Uh, this gets quite complex, but basically, like I said, what you're trying to find by improving this, and this is somewhat oversimplified, right? Because these systems are a bit more complex than I portrayed them. I portrayed like the basics, but you're basically trying to find like the correct weights for this entire system. If there is this set of correct weights, then this would apparently also predict mathematics and could produce new mathematics proofs. It could explain physics and all kinds of complex problems that go beyond our current understanding. So apparently, there is then some number or some set of numbers that together explain everything. That's sort of the way that some people think about the limits of this technology, which seems unlikely. Uh, but like I said, people much more than me disagree on this. I don't know. But if we look at how much AI has improved in the last couple of years, I think it's fair to say that we still have a long way to go to AGI, and it's going to be very difficult to keep improving upon the current systems. And then the reasons that it might. Uh, it did win a gold medal at the International Math Olympiad, something I cannot do. Like it does seem to be very good at science, at some other stuff. It still fucks up when I sometimes ask it to code me something, and or ask it for basic stuff, but it usually is really good at this basic stuff. So maybe it is. Uh, like that's the last point. Who knows? Personally, I did not think it would get as good as it is now. With, I think, Claude Opus, I've seen it produce extremely good code. Probably that, like purely the existence of Claude Opus means I will have to code significantly less in my lifetime than I thought I would. And it means that I have to think more about how to design systems rather than to do the actual coding. So maybe it does find a way to keep improving. When we first found, when the first versions of ChatGPT came online, people were already quite quick to say that there are limits to this technology, and maybe we can't keep improving upon this. So far, we have made some steady progress, so maybe we will get there. But this is all from me, and this was the last part. I hope you guys found this useful, and good luck.